Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on RFPs, Best Practices and Obstacles to Avoid. My name is Matthew Prinn, and I'm a principal with RFP Advisory Group. I've got nearly 20 years of experience in the legal industry, working at small, mid-sized, and large global law firms. The last dozen years, I spent at one of the world's largest law firms, where I oversaw their firm-wide RFP response process. This enabled me to see nearly 150 to 200 RFPs per year across all practices, industries, and regions of the world. I was able to negotiate pricing with corporate counsel and legal procurement professionals, as well as negotiate outside counsel guideline terms. So this enabled me to see which RFPs worked and which RFPs didn't, and come up with some best practices and obstacles to avoid. The program is going to focus at the start on a quick summary of the evolution of the RFP, and then we'll move into how and when they're being used today. Then the bulk of the program is going to be on the key topics that are addressed in RFPs and best practices and obstacles to avoid. And then the final part will be a short Q&A. If I'm unable to, from a time perspective, answer any of the questions from the audience, I promise I will follow up with you via email or one-on-one following the program to answer any questions you may have. You're welcome to submit questions either through email or through the chat box on the right-hand side of your software platform. So we're going to start with the evolution of the RFP. Well, RFPs have been around for a long time in other industries. They really weren't prevalent in the legal industry. We started seeing them around the time of the 2008 financial crisis. So this is an important time because this is really when all of a sudden law firms had a greater supply of lawyers than they had a demand for their services. So what this did is it really shifted the purchasing power. Historically, law firms really controlled a lot of the purchasing power or the negotiating power when it came to providing legal services. And corporate counsel really didn't have much ability to push back. That's why we had the billable hour for the last 100 years, and law firms could just continuously raise rates as needed. But the shift in the purchasing power allowed corporate counsel to finally push back in some areas where they felt they deserved some better service or better value. So what happened was we started seeing requests for bigger discounts and more aggressive pricing negotiations from corporate counsel. And law firms, for the most part, had to accept these deals because they needed the work to keep their lawyers busy. But we also saw an increase in the competition for matters. So whereas corporate counsel historically may have said, we're going to use law firm X for our intellectual property litigation, now if they had a litigation come up, they were looking at 3 or 4 different law firms and saying, tell us why we should hire you, which led to them bidding against each other. And often, the corporate counsel was able to get the matter done at a much reduced cost. We also saw a shift to alternative fee arrangements, and it started out slow right around the time of the recession, but that was really where we started them start to pick up. Now, historically, the billing model of the billable hour really didn't put any risk on the law firm. The risk was really always on the client. If a law firm went over budget, then maybe you could get the bill reduced a little bit, but ultimately you were at the mercy of the law firm's budgeting. And so at this time, we also saw the emergence of what I'm going to call legal operations and legal procurement professionals. Now, procurement is really focused on the buying of whether it's services or materials. Procurement is kind of a process of how you buy them. Legal operations is more of a broader view where they're brought into a corporate counsel legal department to help make the department more efficient, and that can involve a lot more things outside of just billing, just purchasing. So that's when we started to see the emergence of these areas. And law firms' reactions from the recession was to reduce expenses. You saw a lot of reduction in headcount. You saw more of a focus on sales and business development, but you also saw them being much more flexible in negotiating rates. There were a lot of pricing proposals that law firms took on during the post-recession years that they weren't even sure if they were going to make a profit on the matter, but they just needed to keep the lights on and keep the lawyers busy. So procurement has been around for a long time, particularly in other industries outside of legal, but it historically had been used in purchasing materials. And the diagram on the screen shows you kind of the blueprint of the procurement cycle. And what companies did is they saw that procurement was able to reduce costs in all these other departments of the company. And they said, why can't we take those same principles and apply them to the legal industry and to our, to our outside counsel spend? But what happened was it was a very rocky start, because the procurement model was really built for materials and really hadn't been adjusted to professional services. So the initial RFPs we saw that would often come through procurement folks had some questions that just didn't make sense. And they were either asking for data that law firms didn't have, or they were asking questions that law firms couldn't answer based on the way the question was worded. So this led to kind of an initial reaction of, even corporate counsel, oftentimes we would feel like they were being forced, the procurement folks were being forced on the corporate counsel. And law firms often would hear from a corporate counsel, hey, my management's doing an RFP through procurement, but don't worry, I can still hire you, on my own. And so that's kind of how it started. And I think the initial reaction from law firms was, geez, I hope these go away, because law firms really didn't like the initial procurement RFPs that were coming out. So they've evolved over the last 5 and 10 years to a really sophisticated industry, where these procurement folks have really learned the legal industry and they understand how to buy and negotiate for legal services. But their role, just to be clear, really isn't to select law firms. And I think this quote by one of the Fortune 50 senior procurement professionals is a really good quote. And what he's really saying is, we're not the ones who are the decision makers. So we're not saying, we're going to hire law firm A or B, but what we do is collect all the data and provide the metrics to allow the corporate counsel to select the law firms that they think are the best fit. And procurement's not just about getting the lowest price. I think a procurement professional recently said that about 50% of the time they go with the lowest price, but oftentimes they really try to find the best fit. So I thought this was a really good quote that kind of sums up what their role is in today's market. And now these procurement professionals and legal operations at the moment are typically limited to the AmLaw, to the Fortune 100 or 200 companies. But what we're seeing is other companies have noticed some of the success stories, and they're trying to, mimic the process, even if they might not necessarily have as deep a staff or any staff in that area. So why didn't the procurement RFPs go away? Very simple. They were working. So with all the faults that they had, they were still getting reductions in price. And what happened is, if you look as to last year's survey, on average, procurement folks were able to reduce spend by nearly 15%. And that's actually a lower number than what I see in my day-to-day conversations with general counsel and across the industry. We're seeing some RFP programs reduce overall spend by up to 35%. Not all of them, but we are seeing some that are real success stories, not just in reducing cost, but in increasing efficiency. So for the procurement folks, what are their goals in today's market? I think, this chart right here presents, their top goals, but I think, you'll notice the ones in orange: reducing legal spend, better managing legal work, and reducing the number of legal providers are the three that really jump out at me. And then you compare that to what are corporate counsel's top priorities. And if you look at the graph on the screen, you'll see that 4 of the top 5 priorities of corporate counsel, as noted in the survey, are all issues that can be addressed by using an RFP as a tool. So that's really why we see such a good partnering of corporate counsel and legal procurement. Whereas originally I thought there was some friction, we're now seeing that the procurement folks have really earned a seat at the table based on some of the results that they were able to produce. So let's speed up now to when and how are RFPs being used in today's market. So like I said, originally they started kind of with the larger companies who had legal operations and legal procurement folks to run these types of RFPs, but we've now seen smaller corporate counsel legal departments issuing RFPs, and we're finding that there's a lot of obstacles that they need to overcome, but they're all typically finding them to be a successful process. However, if you manage them incorrectly, they can be very labor intensive. So, this quote right here is from the CLO survey, and it notes the outside counsel being really low-hanging fruit. When you're looking at expenses, most corporate counsel will provide feedback that they don't think their outside law firms are as efficient and as cost-effective as they could be. So whether it's negotiating discounts or converting to alternative fee arrangements, that's really considered the low-hanging fruit in the industry at the moment. And most general counsel are really attacking that. So, how do you reduce costs? This is a survey based on corporate counsel views. And I think it's really interesting. As you'll see, the #1 tactic being used is price negotiations. And most are finding that fairly effective in experiencing improvement. But I think if you looked at some of the other items noted, for example, ALSP, that stands for Alternative Legal Service Provider. There are a lot of new companies, many of them technology-based, that are entering the market that are starting to take away some of the market share from the traditional law firm. Now, in many cases, they're doing this by using technology to be able to handle certain types of often lower level work, but at a much reduced cost and with greater efficiency. And what I found interesting in this survey is, while only 20% of those surveys were using them, those who were using them found 84% of them found them to experience improvement. So I think that's something to note. Just as if you look at AFAs, you'll see that a majority, 71% of folks were 51% of folks were using the tactic, and many of them found that to really show results in improvement. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the types of RFPs that are out there. I'm going to drop them into 3 buckets. The main and the most popular RFP that we see is what we call the Preferred Panel Provider RFP. And generally what this is when a company is using, let's say, 50 law firms, and they say, we want to reduce that number to a dozen. And of those dozen, we want to create better relationships with those 12 law firms. Now, as part of the process, the firms that are selected to be on the panel typically have to agree to an outside counsel guideline set of terms. So this allows the company to kind of create rules and guidelines for their law firms so they can kind of help better control some of the issues that they might have historically faced with law firms. These RFPs typically are questions that are not about a specific matter, but rather are broad-based questions about the firm as a whole, or the practice group, or the industry group as a whole. So a company would look at its annual legal spend in a certain area and issue an RFP for the work that's covered, during the course of that year. And, the preferred panel provider RFPs, the main goal is oftentimes for a law firm for a corporate counsel to create a panel of firms where they're probably sending 85 to 90% of their work to these firms. They still have the right to use firms not on the panel, but they try to limit that to, kind of exceptions, and they try to steer as much work as they can to these panel RFPs. You'll often hear the word convergence when it comes to the panel RFPs, because the majority of them typically try to reduce the number of law firms they're using. And there are a lot of benefits, as noted on the right-hand side of the slide, of the convergence method. And, ideally, companies are hoping to reduce cost, increase efficiency, and get better legal results. And, they found these convergence RFPs a good tool to get there. So the most popular convergence RFP that I've seen in the industry and that I was part of was Avis Budget Group's RFP that they issued a few years back, where they went from 700 law firms that they were using globally, and they reduced that down to 7. And this is really an extreme example, and I wouldn't recommend it for most corporate counsel unless you're really sophisticated in the process and have significant buy-in from the company as a whole. But in this case, Avis realized that they had a ton of inefficiencies by using so many different law firms. They had 700 different invoices, 700 different billing arrangements. In this case, they said, we're going to issue an RFI to our law firms. Now, an RFI is what you often issue before an RFP that helps you qualify which firms you want to invite to the RFP. So they whittled that number down after the RFI from, let's say, 700 to 150, issued an RFP to those 150 firms, whittled that down, and ended up selecting one firm per practice area. So, one firm that was going to handle their IP, one firm that was going to handle their real estate. But what they did that was kind of unique was they really, rather than having the outside counsel, fight each other for work, they really had approached it as they're going to be their team. That was almost an extension of the in-house counsel. So what this meant was there really wasn't a competition for work, but rather, the corporate law firm and the employment law firm really had to work together because so much overlaps in the different matters. And they did this by, they created a orientation at the beginning where they got all the law firms that were selected together, and they spent, either a day or 2 days really going over the system and the process and how they expected things to work, and allowed for feedback. And it was really, a very cohesive process between the inside and outside counsel. One other thing that was really interesting about this RFP, and by the way, if you see in the appendix, I've linked to 2 articles that go into much more detail about this RFP, how it was done and what it accomplished. But one of the things that they did is they did an internal audit of all their legal spend over the prior 3 to 5 years. And they said, okay, we looked at all the work that we're sending out to law firms, and we determined which work they bucketed each type of work into 3 buckets. One was a commodity bucket where they said, okay, here's legal services that we need done that's on the lower end, that's more commoditized. And then they said, here's another bucket for core work that we think is, standard legal work that needs to be done. And then they had a third bucket for complex bet the company matters. And those were often more sophisticated, and they were more willing to pay higher prices for that work. And they had each law firm bid a blended rate for each of the buckets of services. Now, they didn't necessarily, they still had flexibility to negotiate the pricing with the firms at further down the line in the in-person presentation meetings. But this at least enabled them to benchmark the different law firms out there, so they could kind of put them on their own internal list as far as, price sensitivity. So I suggest you read the 2 articles because they'll go into a lot more detail on the amount of savings and inefficiencies they created. But this is just one kind of success story that's out there. Another one, and this is from the 2018 ACC Value Challenge winners, is 7-Eleven. And what they did was also very interesting, is they did the internal look at their spend, and they realized that their real estate spend was much greater than they had thought. And they didn't think that they had a system in place that was adequately allocating work as to whether it should be done by outside counsel or inside counsel. So in this case, they had 5 firms that they issued the RFP to. And they basically said, we want to move our work to, one firm, but we want to really find a partner who's going to sit down and strategize with us and come up with a system as to, for each type of real estate work that comes in, what's best done in-house, what's best done by outside law firms, and how can we kind of mutually work together to reach, to meet our business goals for 7-Eleven. And so Seyfarth Shaw was the firm that was selected, and they've got a lot of experience on project management. And one of the benefits that they were able to do was they came in and developed a system for 7-Eleven so that work was better allocated between inside and outside counsel. And in some cases, that means hiring more in-house counsel. But what they did that I thought was really interesting was they also said, the work that you send to external counsel, to us, we're going to allocate that as well. And what they found was a certain portion of work that was lower level, more commoditized work that didn't need to be done by one of the key lawyers in one of the metropolitan cities, but Seyfarth had a back office operation where they could handle legal work in an area of the U.S. where it was more cost effective. It was a low cost area, so they charged. The attorneys had lower billing rates, and they were able to shift this work to professionals in those areas that created a cost reduction. And so you'll see some stats on the slide, but again, if you read the article about how they did it, I drafted a case study of a couple pages that shows kind of step-by-step what they did and how they did it to show, to give an example for other corporate counsel who might want to try a similar exercise. So the second type of RFP that we see are matter-specific RFPs. Now, the two prior examples I provided were both instances where the corporate counsel really selected one law firm per practice area. But that's not necessarily always the norm. I would say a lot of the RFPs out there, what they'll do is, you might have 60 law firms that are on the panel, and let's say there's 5 IP firms. So what they do is what's called a matter-specific RFP. So you answer the first RFP to be on the board, to be on the panel, and then they'll issue specific RFPs for each matter that comes out. So if all of a sudden they had an IP litigation matter come out, they would reach out to their 5 IP firms on the panel, and they would say, typically in this case, it would be shorter questions, oftentimes just via email might be 4 questions. But what they say is, for this specific matter in front of this specific judge, for this technology, why should we select you versus the other 4 firms on the panel? And oftentimes what corporate counsel will do is they'll allocate different levels of firms on the panel. So of these 5 IP firms on the panel, you might have a boutique law firm, you might have a mid-sized regional firm, you might have a global law firm or a regional law firm, and you're going to get different types of pricing, different types of strategy, and it allows the corporate counsel to kind of pick and choose as opposed to just having one option coming back to you. So an example I'll give of a matter-specific RFP is from a global information services or information management company. They were doing an M&A matter in China. And so they reached out to the 5 firms that were on their M&A panel. And they said, this was on a Wednesday and they wanted the answers by Friday. So we had about 48 hours. The questions were only 4 questions. And none of the questions were, tell us about the firm or tell us, about your capabilities broadly, because we already know that. That's why you made it on the panel to begin with. But the questions were, what's your experience with M&A matters in China? What would be the proposed team and what's their experience on M&A matters in China? What's your strategy, for this particular matter or this engagement? And what's the cost? Now, they said, we don't know if we've given you enough information to do a fixed bid, so an estimate's okay, but we ultimately want to hire a firm on a fixed bid once we're able to discuss the details of the matter in more detail. So in this instance, our firm, looked at the questions. These are the type of responses that have to be answered by the lawyer. So you're not going to get marketing language. You're not going to get, stuff from the website. You're going to get specific, direct, custom answers. And in this case, we said we can do this. We think we can do it between $250,000 and $325,000. They then came back to us and said, we'd like to select you if you're willing to do it for a fixed fee of $250,000. So then, we agreed. And then ideally, the law firm then says, okay, what's our strategy where we'll be able to do this for $250,000? You can't keep the same strategy that you had you thought it was going to be $400,000. You've got to really adjust to try to make it profitable for the law firm. So that's an example of how companies, typically larger companies, are using matter-specific RFPs. And that really gives them the benefit of not only just seeing the different options, but getting different strategy suggestions. So you might have one law firm who can come up with a really outside-the-box innovative strategy that you might never have thought of had you only gone to 1 or 2 law firms. The third bucket of RFPs is what I call specialty RFPs. There's a lot of folks on the call today who I noticed were from government or public entities, public pension plans, etc. I should note that RFPs done for the government or certain public entities, they have certain rules and regulations that they have to abide by that a private company doesn't when it comes to issuing an RFP. They've got to post it publicly, make it available, and they have certain questions that they have to ask. So a lot of times, law firms in particular, these are RFPs that sometimes are more labor intensive to respond to because the questions, are so standard that they don't necessarily always fit a law firm well, and they often have a lot of forms to fill out. I'm not going to go through on each point as to how it would impact each one, but just know that the government RFPs, they do have certain rules and regulations that they need to abide by that other corporate counsel don't need to do and have a lot more flexibility. The next type that I drop into the specialty, and these are newer to the market, but they're really interesting and they're really successful for the companies that are using them right. Now, most law firms will tell you they hate these. In fact, I know some law firms who refuse to even participate in reverse auctions as they feel like they're, a suicidal pricing and a race to the bottom. But it's particularly the larger Fortune 50 companies who have a lot of purchasing power when it comes to legal services. They love these reverse auctions, because what a reverse auction is you basically create a virtual bidding room online. Law firms log in, they know all the details of the matter. So let's say it's a litigation, they've gotten all the details and they've agreed that they, are interested in representing the company in this case. And then it's literally, picture an auction, but in reverse. You go in and bid as to what you'd be willing to do the matter for, and you can see the other bids in the room. You don't know the name of the law firm. It'll say law firm A, law firm B, law firm C, but you can see what they're bidding and you can adjust your bid. And there's a set period of time. And then at the end of the, when the clock expires, the firm, typically with the lowest price is selected. So, when this first came out, I think law firms weren't very prepared to handle a reverse auction RFP. Typically, they just didn't have their metrics in place and a system in place to really be able to look at a proposed matter and say, what the profit line would be, what the profit margin, the lowest they could do the matter on and still make a profit on. So there was some risk in law firms in bidding on these. You could bid on it and then end up losing your shirt on it if you bid incorrectly. So law firms have gotten a lot smarter. They've hired pricing directors, they've got legal project managers, they've got software, and they're now able to give much more accurate bids. So we are seeing some people in the industry reduce costs as much as 35 or 40% on certain matters by using this process. But I would caution, it's not for the faint of heart or for those just starting into RFPs. I think that's, it's really better done by someone who has some experience and sophistication in running the RFP process. So key issues to address in RFPs, and this is where we're going to go through the best practices and obstacles to avoid. There are similar topics in almost all RFPs. In fact, part of me thinks that there's, a template out there of the same RFP that keeps going around from corporate counsel to corporate counsel, because we often will see the same questions being asked. But they're all really hitting on the key issues, and I'm going to go through each one. First, when it comes to RFPs for structure and format, they typically, I would say the majority are probably still in Word, but we do see some in Excel. We see some folks using online portals like Ariba. And now, particularly the last few years, we've really seen the entrance of RFP software. So there are companies out there who have created software that can be used to better execute, to better issue an RFP. So rather than getting 50 Word documents back, you have a software program that allows you to compare apples to apples on the responses a little bit easier than manually had you done it with Word. Now, some of these software programs might be better for folks who are doing, 10 or 11 or 10 or a dozen RFPs per year. If you're only doing, one as part of a panel firm, you might not need to go that route, but they are available. Now, RFPs typically have 3 to 4 stages. For the companies that have a good understanding of their historical legal spend, they can typically just issue an RFP. If you don't have that rear view mirror look, oftentimes you might be new to the job, a new corporate counsel, and you might not necessarily know the history of the last 3 to 5 years. What you can do is issue an RFI, which is a request for information. This is basically a questionnaire that goes to law firms that you can ask them to summarize what they've done for your company over the last few years, who's worked on matters, what work have they done, what has been the pricing model. So this allows you more information to better structure your RFP. Obviously, the next step is to actually issue the RFP. And then, that's the written response that you send out and that comes back in. The third phase is typically, and it really is imperative, you don't want to hire a law firm based on a piece of paper. The RFP gets you to the second stage, which is the in-person presentation meetings. So what that means is, let's say you're going to hire, you're going to put 10 people on the panel. You might want to bring in 20 firms for in-person presentations. And this is typically, an hour presentation where the law firm, sits down and either presents why they should be selected or answers a series of questions from the corporate counsel. Those are really must-haves, and that's where I suggest a lot of the pricing negotiation should take place, because it's a lot easier to do when you can have a back and forth rather than just putting question on a piece of paper. The last part, and this is not always done, but it really should be, is the post-RFP feedback and orientation session. So what this means is the folks who were selected, it's good to tell them why they were selected, and the folks who weren't selected, you want to also share feedback with them, because if you want them to bid on future RFPs you have, it always makes sense to tell them what they did or didn't do right in the RFP. Otherwise, they'll just think it's a wild goose chase and not worth their time for future opportunities. Orientation, like I mentioned with ABG, this is really just bringing the folks together, whether it's a phone call or in person. It's good for law firms to know the other law firms that are working for the company, because oftentimes it'll create a less adversarial relationship if they know who it is, and sometimes it might make more sense for a matter to be done by one firm rather than another, or they might have locations in a certain area of the world that one firm doesn't. And it's just, the more you can kind of get these folks on the same page, the better. Obstacles to avoid in the format and the structure. Generally speaking, you want to write questions that avoid canned marketing language. You do not want someone like, from a law firm to be able to go to the website and cut and paste, a 3-page description of their practice, or give you really generic commentary. What you want is customized answers based on your company. And to get those, you really need to write the questions in the right way. Another best practice would be, you need to provide detailed information on your company, your legal issues, and your legal operations. Otherwise, it makes it really difficult for law firms to give strategic responses, particularly when it comes to pricing. I can't tell you how many RFPs are issued where they barely give you the bare minimum about the legal spend, or their how many people in their department, or how many trademarks they have, how many, whatever details it is, and then they'll keep that all out of the RFP, and then they'll expect the law firm to come up with a fixed price, or to come up with specific strategic advice. Law firms really need detailed information if you want to get detailed, customized responses. If you ask a generic question, you're most likely going to get generic responses. From a timing perspective, if it's a panel RFP, make sure you give at least 3 weeks. We've seen some folks, particularly outside the US, issue these large RFPs and try to give you a week to respond. You're just, based on the law firm business model and how busy partners are working on current matters, if you want to get a high quality response, you have to give the law firm typically at least 3 to 4 weeks at a minimum for a significant RFP. Capabilities and expertise, that's the next topic that we always see in all RFPs, and ultimately when it comes to decision making, experience and expertise in a particular area is often the #1 factor. But the way you ask these questions will really change the type of responses you get. So, here's on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the typical questions you can ask. But you really want to focus, when you can, on, you want to get answers that are based on the team who's going to be representing you. So, for example, if you want to know about a firm's, capabilities in a certain area, the more you can find out the experience of the people who'll be working for you, the better you'll be. Because particularly with a large law firm, some of these law firms have 2,000 lawyers. You don't want to get a bunch of experience that's right on point and perfect, and then find out that it's not the experience of your lawyer, but an experience of a different lawyer, 2 continents over, that you will never work on any of your matters. So the more you can kind of focus your questions to extract information from the folks who'll be working on your matters, the better questions you'll get. Better responses you'll get. Also, this is, almost a no-brainer, but put page limits or word limits on responses. Otherwise, you're going to be way overwhelmed with 100, 200-page responses. If you ask a question like, please tell us about your corporate M&A capabilities, a firm like mine that I used to work for, we could give you 20 pages, because that's how deep and broad-based our corporate practice was. So what you really want to get from folks is short, concise answers that highlights their competitive advantages, or highlights how their experience will benefit you. And just in the way you draft that question can shave off tons of time as far as reviewing. What we find is a lot of corporate counsel issue an RFP, and then they're massively overwhelmed with the responses because they just weren't expecting, a 200-page response. But generally speaking, when it comes to experience, you also want to ask them what separates them from their peers who also have practices in that area. What are they best at? What's their sweet spot? And if they say everything, well, ideally you want to find out what are they best known for, or what type of work is really their strength or their competitive advantage. Here's just a quick chart that shows you decision-making factors from the procurement folks, kind of what they see in the market as far as why firms are selected based on, low commodity work versus the high bet the company work. The next topic is staffing. And staffing is something that is, I think, near and dear to a lot of corporate counsel's heart, because they often just don't see efficiencies that they'd like to see. And what I mean by that is you want to learn from the law firm what's their strategy behind staffing. So, for example, I gave you the example with 7-Eleven, where Safarth was able to say, for this certain type of work, we would strategically staff it by sending that work to folks in low-cost areas of our company. So that's an example of a strategy to help reduce costs but keep the same high-quality, result. Ideally, you want to know who the relationship manager is, how you're going to work with them, what other clients they might have. Are you going to be their biggest client, or are you going to be, very low on the rung and might not get that phone call returned as quick as you want? So the more you can learn about the team, the better. Things to avoid: I would really avoid asking for bios of everybody in a practice area. In fact, bios in general, the generic ones that are on law firms' websites, don't provide you a lot of value. What I would ask for in an RFP is, and remember, a lot of partners at law firms have bios that are 8 to 10 pages. So think about that when you're asking for 30 lawyer bios and all of a sudden you get 200 pages of bios back. What are you even going to do with that? No one's going to spend the time to go through all those. So what you really want to do is just focus the question to say, please provide a short paragraph summary that will explain who would be on our team and what their role would be. Because that's really what you want to know, what their role is and why they're suited to handle this. Next, we're going to talk about market trends with staffing. And this is just an example of why it's important to ask for strategy. This survey in front of us notes that half of the equity partners in law firms today aren't as busy as they could be. So what you want to avoid is having a law firm partner who, let's say their utilization is low and they need to up their hours, be doing work that could be done by associate or even a paralegal in some instances. So you just want to know that that's out there. And a lot of the alternative fee billing arrangements eliminate issues like this. But if you are doing hourly billing, you really just want to be sure that there's a strategy behind it. And typically this can be a conversation that you could have with the lead partner before a matter starts, where you might even say to them, this is something that we just want senior partners on, or this is something that, we don't feel is a priority, so we're okay with it being done by a more cost-effective option. This is just interesting, I think, for some of you to see the law firm's point of view when it comes to staffing. This is what they find effective and what they use the most. Just something to refer back to if you ever need to. Pricing. So pricing's involved in all RFPs. I don't know if I've ever seen an RFP that didn't have pricing as part of it. And it's, I could do a whole webinar just on pricing. So I'm only going to really touch, a few areas here. But I think the most important thing is most of the RFPs we see today, they want to convert, or at least discuss converting from a billable hour to an alternative fee arrangement. But what happened when these questions first started coming out is all law firms had a generic answer that said, yes, we're open to AFAs. We often do, and they list the different models, and they might give a generic definition of what each model is. But that's not really what you want. What you want them to be able to come back in and say, based on our work that we have, our expected legal matters, what AFA structures have you worked on with other clients similar to ours that we could potentially use on our matters? And in order for a law firm to be able to answer that question, you've got to give them the detail. So whether that happens in the written response or later on in the price negotiations and the in-person meetings, law firms cannot come up with a fixed bid unless you provide them at least some insight into the volume of work and how it's currently being done, and just whatever details that you can provide, you need to if you want to get accurate answers. Otherwise, what you're going to get is very generic answers that say, yes, we're all open to AFAs. No law firm out there is really going to tell you that they're not open to an AFA. But what you want to know from them is, what ones do you think would work based on the type of legal services we need, and how would those work? So what people typically ask for, and this can cause a lot of issues for law firms, but you often see like a rate card being presented. And I just want to go through a couple examples of why rate cards oftentimes just can be meaningless. So here's an example of one that came in through an RFP for a firm that I was working at, where we had 40 different practice groups across 5 continents. So what that means is no practice group is the same. So if you're asking us about our investment management practice group, well, our partner rates, might be $900 an hour. But if you're asking us about our labor and employment attorneys, a partner rate in a low-cost office like, let's say North Carolina, that might be $400 an hour. So if you ask like a very broad-based question like that, the information that you're going to get back is almost meaningless. So what you want to do is first identify, what are you looking for? Are you looking for data for benchmarking purposes so that you can just kind of look at all the law firms and kind of place them as far as, lowest cost provider to highest? Then say that in the question. Say, this is not we're not asking you for a bid of what you're actually going to charge us. We're just asking you for data that we can benchmark against other firms to see where you fall, on the ladder of pricing. Now, oftentimes you'll see blended rates being asked for. And again, anytime you do something like that, it's always better to specify by practice group. So it's better to have 10 rate tables in there, one for each practice group, than one for the whole firm, because the one for the whole firm is almost meaningless. Now, if one bit of caution, I don't consider a blended rate an AFA, and most pricing folks don't, but it's often looped into it. If you are asking for a blended rate, that's basically just saying, no matter, blended rate by title would say, any partner that works on the matter gets, bills this, any associate bills this. Just be careful with that, because that allows law firms to then adjust their staffing to what works best for them. And oftentimes, you're just not going to have a law firm have a $900 an hour partner billing at $600 an hour if that's the blended rate. They'll shift the work to different lawyers, and you might not be getting the A lawyer for your matter. You might be getting a lawyer who's low in utilization, and they just need to find him work. And maybe that lawyer might not be the best for the role, but it's the only way that they can do it at that rate and make it profitable. So just keep that in mind. If you are going to issue rate cards or data, make sure you say this is just for benchmarking. But if you actually want them to be proposed prices, then you've got to specify that, and you'll get much different answers. Like I said, the biggest mistake of the early RFPs that we saw was just a lot of companies asking for bids and not giving nearly enough information. If you want a hard bid, like we had, an RFP last year, where they wanted us to bid on their entire work for the year and they're a fixed price, which, a law firm could do, but you've got to really be able to give them historical spend. You've got to be able to give them, what your legal operations currently is in that area of law, so that they know how much work would be done in-house and how much they would have to do. And that's really not something that they can pull together based on a written piece of paper. That's much better. I mean, it's almost better to do the written part of the pricing response is stage one, but the actual finalization of the terms is done over the phone or in an in-person meeting where you can ask questions and kind of go back and forth. One piece on pricing that I think most RFPs have, but if you don't, it's something to consider, because it's really hard for a law firm to not offer up a discount in this area, is what they call volume discounts. So we're seeing that in a lot of RFPs where basically this is the company just saying, the more volume we give you, we expect a discount, an escalating discount based on certain thresholds. So for the first $500,000 we send to you, we want a 1% discount off the volume. The next $500,000, we want a 2%, and on and on and on. And for some companies with large legal spend, they're able to get significant discounts just by including this question in an RFP, because most law firms are likely to have to agree to the volume discount. They've learned to push back and negotiate better, because if we're already getting $2 million a year from the corporate client, we don't want to all of a sudden just give them 5% discount off that volume with nothing else in return, because we're then just eating away at our profits. Oftentimes what a law firm will say is, let's start the volume escalator based on additional work beyond what we did last year for you. When it comes to market trends for pricing, law firms after the recession, like I said, were agreeing to a lot of matters that just weren't profitable for them. They got a lot smarter. What they did is they hired pricing directors, they purchased software, and they realized that they need to have a better understanding of what their profit margin is per matter. Most law firms still don't really know that, but they now have a better general idea. But what you are seeing from them is more aggressive, increasing billing rates more aggressively. So as I noted before, if this is a problem for you and you feel like it's an issue with your outside law firms, that's the type of thing that you can address in the outside counsel guidelines, which I'll talk about in a few slides. But I just thought that you might find this interesting, that from a law firm point of view, this is what they're doing to improve profitability. Again, here's a law firm view from pricing as far as what they're doing, what tactics they're using that they find effective, and that they're the ones they're using and which ones are the most effective. Project management and efficiency. Ultimately, the #1 complaint we often hear from corporate counsel with law firms is budgeting. So they don't like the surprises of getting an estimate for $500,000 and then getting the phone call, or even worse, just getting the bill and having it be $700,000. They want to know in advance any budget predictability that they can get. So project management has really grown in the legal industry over the last 10 years, partly because of the software that's out there. Most of the, at least large law firms now, have incorporated software that helps lawyers better manage matters, so that they can give you a screenshot or a report to the client that says, at this point of the matter, this is where we are. And this is what we see in a lot of RFPs. People are asking for questions, what they're using and how they're using them. One tip in this area is, don't be fooled by the law firm that talks about, an outlier example. So there might be one law firm, there might be some partners at a big law firm who use software tool management and present reports to their clients. And if you ask the question in a broad way, you're going to get that example, that kind of outlier example of that partner who uses this great software. You want to know the people that work with you, what are they going to use? So you want to say, can I get an example of the relationship manager, a sample report that he gives to clients on matters? Ultimately, it's all about, budget predictability and project management. And again, AFAs can address some of these issues too, but particularly if you're still in the hourly billable model, project management can be really important. Just again, here's another stat that just shows the law firm's view as far as what they find effective when it comes to project management. I think it's a work in progress, but particularly some of the more sophisticated law firms are starting to adjust comp, because what you saw was a lot of partners would agree to a fixed fee, and then the matter would just go way over budget, and we'd end up only, the realization would be like 50%. And law firms really need to get that realization into the 80s, if not higher. So, law firms are smartened up, and the only way to make lawyers change behavior is by their compensation. And some smart law firms have really learned how to incorporate that. Technology and innovation. Technology innovation is in the legal industry is all over the place right now. Every week there's a new product that's going to revolutionize the industry. So you could apply technology to almost any of the areas we've already talked about. But what you see on your right-hand side here is a question this is a general sample of a question you see in the technology and innovation area. But what you really want to know from your law firms is, what technology are you using, and how are you using it to help reduce our costs or become more efficient? And again, an example with alternative intelligence. There are a lot of firms who have press releases that say what they're doing with AI. And some firms have incorporated into certain matters. but a good percentage of the firm, a lot of people say, geez, I see all this stuff on your website about alternative intelligence, but how come I don't see it on my matters? So what you really want to do is ask them a question in the form of, what technology can you use on our matters, and how would you use it to help incorporate technology to innovate legal services? Earlier I mentioned ALSPs, alternative legal service providers. This is also an area in an RFP where you can ask the law firm, do you collaborate with ALSPs? And if you do, please provide some examples in case that's something we want to do. Now, I would probably say it's a better idea to do a separate RFP for ALSPs and basically separate that from the RFP that you're doing to your external counsel. And I would probably even do that potentially before, because what you want to really see is, of the work we have, what work is best suited for an ALSP, and what type of cost reductions or efficiencies could we get by using them. And I don't know if the law firms are really going to always volunteer that information, so it's often better to go to them directly. When it comes to innovation, I think most corporate counsel will say that corporate counsel in general have a lot of room to grow when it comes to innovation, but the areas where they're seeing it the most are noted in the graph on your left-hand side. I don't think any of these are very surprising, but of course, project management, AFA pricing are two that easily jump out. Right here, we've got a chart that just shows some of the innovation in the legal industry and kind of how it would be categorized as far as how it's impacted the legal industry. So this is just more for reference, but you'll see how some of them are incremental changes, and then you've got things that are really breakthrough changes, like e-signatures. That's a piece of technology that really improved the process, and that was a really big breakthrough. Now on the transformational side, I think AI is knocking on the door, but for most law firms, they really haven't implemented it enough in a large scale manner. I thought a lot of corporate counsel might find this chart interesting. This is what law firms say is the biggest competition to them right now. Of course, companies hiring more in-house counsel right now is the biggest concern. But if you look to the future, you'll see technology and ALSPs are, especially with Big Four entering the legal world globally, they're making some moves that I think making a lot of law firms nervous. Three other areas that are referenced in RFPs: client service, diversity, and references. When it comes to client service, every law firm is going to say they give great client service. So what you really want to do is try to ask questions that kind of narrow it down and learn what is the client service model for the particular client team that's going to be working for you. Don't let the law firm get away with just the generic, we give great client service. What does that mean as far as responsiveness, as far as added value, as far as knowing our business? Really try to pull from them what makes their client service so good. And then when it comes to diversity, this is a big area in today's market, and a lot of corporate counsel want to increase the diversity of the folks who work on their matters. There's a few ways you can go about it. Some folks like to ask for the hard stats. How many, how many minority lawyers or how many female lawyers do you have, and compared to overall lawyers, and they'll often give you a table to fill out. I don't know how beneficial the table will be when you're actually grading the responses. I think a better way to attack it is to say, of the folks that are going to be working for us, please describe how you can make that a diverse team so we can see actual real-time changes. Or you might ask them, as a firm, what are your broader initiatives? And then they can at least tell you their initiatives when it comes to diversity. And you can look and say, okay, they're making the effort, or they've been able to do X, Y, Z. But just getting a bunch of numbers doesn't really tell you the story. It's not going to make much of a difference in what you see in your actual matters. But we do have some lawyers, Microsoft's got a plan out there now where they track the diversity of each lawyer, and law firms need to have a certain percentage staffing their matters. Otherwise, they might lose the work. So, there are tools out there to do it that way as well, but Microsoft's really on the far end of the sophistication in that area. When it comes to references, another tip along the same theme is you really want to get a reference from the folks who are working on your matters about the issues that are of concern to you. So if you just say, please give us 3 references, the law firm's going to use the same 3 references that they use for every other RFP, And it's basically just friends, not friends, but clients of the firm that are going to say nice things, generally, regardless of the firm, no matter who calls. But what you want to do is say, okay, the relationship manager that I'm going to be dealing with all the time, what I want to know is, what do his other clients say about him? And even more specifically, I want to know, what about his client service, or what about his pricing? And try to get a reference that narrows it down to the areas of concern or that you're focusing on. Most law firms will be willing to give a reference per lawyer or even per client team. If you can't get that, then oftentimes people will ask for a reference from a similar sized company or from someone in the same industry, just so you can get a better idea that they know your industry or are used to working with clients of your size and structure. Outside counsel guidelines, I talked about at the beginning. This is really the corporate counsel's chance to put together, quote unquote, the rules that they want their law firms to follow. So these range from 2 pages to, I've negotiated some that are as many as 45 pages. And oftentimes the law firm's general counsel has to review these outside counsel guidelines to ensure that the law firm can agree to them. But here's 6 areas that are typically covered in most of these guidelines. Rate freezes. What we often see is a corporate counsel will say, we don't want, for the duration of this panel period, we do not want our law firms raising the rates. So the rates are frozen until the next panel period. Conflicts. Corporate counsel would like to know what your process is, what the law firm's process is for conflicts, how you address them. But also, you'll often see a list provided that says, these are our key competitors. Please tell us any conflicts that you might have, because the corporate counsel might want to know, if you're Nike and they're doing work for Reebok, that might be too close for comfort for you. And the outside counsel guidelines allows you the ability to ask these type of questions. Staffing restrictions. We've seen this where in the guidelines, they might say, we don't want more than 3 lawyers on a phone call, or we don't want a specific lawyer to bill more than 8 hours a day. Actually, one thing we're seeing due to the recent somewhat outrageous first-year associate salaries that we're seeing some corporate counsels say, I don't want a first-year associate working on my matters, and law firms have to agree to that in the outside counsel guidelines. But on the other hand, from the law firm's perspective, they will often push back and say, well, the value is better for the client if we do it this way. So I wouldn't look at the outside counsel guidelines as, concrete. You might end up having to adjust the guidelines for each term, for each different law firm based on what they're willing to agree to. Data security, you'll see these in all questions in all RFPs now. Most law firms have a dedicated cybersecurity person, and they can provide information as far as how often the law firm's cyber security system has been tested. For banks or financial institutions, they often ask in RFPs for scorecards that the law firm has received grading their cyber capabilities. In fact, I think it's a requirement for the big banks out there. Law firms have to provide certain information about audits that have been done on their practices. But again, those are all in the outside counsel guidelines. Billing guidelines more generally, e-billing, things like that. Preferences you have when it comes to billing, how many days, payment turnaround. You can put all that information, and most law firms are pretty open to the terms that come in, and we typically don't have to push back too much in that area. The last one is value add. So value add basically means free. And one of the things that we see in a lot of the RFPs, particularly the larger dollar RFPs, corporate counsel are saying, if we're going to be sending you millions of dollars of work, what are you going to give us for free? And I wrote, here's a kind of a long form question that you can refer to that talks about the different things that they ask for. But I wrote an article or published a piece on the top 5 items that corporate counsel are getting in these negotiations, and it's linkable via the appendix at the end of your materials. But here's the 5 most common pieces of added value that are being asked of law firms. The most popular is the hotline access to quick questions. What this is really corporate counsel want a certain number of hours per month that they can call the law firm and get ad hoc questions answered. These aren't questions that require a lot of research. they're more 5, 10, 15-minute conversations. And a lot of law firms are willing to agree to, let's say, an hour per month, 2 hours per month. But you want to ensure that you put the assumptions in there that says, just so you're on the same page. It doesn't mean you can call, a lawyer at a law firm where bills $1,000 an hour, talk to them for an hour about a project, and then just say, oh, that's our free hour. It's really meant to be for the types of questions that are very ad hoc, that you don't necessarily want to run a legal bill for, but would be valuable just to bounce off the lawyer really quickly. So 4 of the 5 of these, I think, are pretty standard. Most law firms will agree to them. The secondment issue is very dicey. Some of the large corporations out there are able to get free secondments from law firms. However, unless you're sending them a really significant amount of work, most law firms are pushing back on secondments. They'll be willing to give them at a reasonable cost, a reduced cost for a reasonable amount of time, but they're not going to just give a lawyer to the client for free with nothing in exchange. You have to be a real large company to send a lot of money to a law firm for them to just agree to that. So that's more of a negotiation, and it'll depend on what type of lawyer. So we've ran into some issues where law firms will agree to a secondment and the corporate counsel will think that means they get any lawyer they want in any practice area for 3 months. No, what it means is really that the law firm is willing to consider certain lawyers for certain time periods. So you really want to put that in the RFP, just so you don't get surprised when the corporate counsel thinks it means one thing and the law firm thinks it means the other. The number one question in any RFP, and the most important reason you're doing an RFP, is competitive advantages. This is really where the rubber meets the road, where you're saying to the law firms, tell us what you do better than your competitors. Tell us why we should hire you. When my president or CEO walks into the office and asks the general counsel, why did we hire this law firm? This is what they should be able to pull out. These should be short, concise, bulleted answers that say, here's what we do better than other law firms. Whether it's their geography, where they can say, we're all across the world, so we can create efficiencies by putting all that work with one law firm. Or it might be a boutique firm that says, this is all we do. We don't mess with any other area of law. We just do this one area and we're really good at it. Or it could be a cost thing, where a firm might say, based on our expenses and our business model, we can do the same work as our peer firms at a 25% less of a cost. But whatever it is, you want to ask these questions from the law firms to ensure that you're getting short, concise answers in non-legal speak. You want this just to be as clear as possible as to what their advantages are. And the ironic thing about this is most law firms, as you can see by the stat, about half of them have a hard time identifying their competitive advantages. And I think a lot of them are working towards that, but it's not always as clear-cut what the difference is between, one AmLaw 100 M&A practice and another firm's AmLaw 100 M&A practice. So, that's something you just want to be aware of in the process. So that covers all the general areas that we were looking at today in regards to RFPs, but I wanted to answer a few questions that came in before the program, and if I have any time, I'll answer the questions that have been submitted via the chat box. One question was, how long does a panel RFP typically take? A panel RFP of, let's say, 50 firms that you want to reduce to 12, you should give yourself at least 3 months from the planning and issuing of the RFP to the reviewing the materials, the in-person presentations, and the actual selection. I think a lot of RFPs, probably half of the ones I see, will come out with a timeline, and then the timeline gets totally blown out of the water and it takes them 2, 3, 4 times as long as they expected, partly because of the overwhelming responses they received. And they didn't necessarily expect it to take so long to review all the different RFPs. So, a general ballpark number is 3 months. The larger or more sophisticated the process, the longer it's going to be. Obviously, if it's a matter-specific RFP, those can be as short as 2 days. In that case, those questions are really questions that are often emailed and just answered by the lawyers who are working on the matter. But the more formal ones, you should really plan for 3 months at least. When's the best time to issue an RFP? There isn't one time that I'd say is the perfect time. I would rather say avoid December, end of the year, when law firms are focused on billing and collection. I would avoid having them do the day after a holiday or the day before a holiday. The reason I say that is because you're just going to get a less of a quality response. You'll also see more law firms reaching out to you asking for an extension. If, for example, you have an RFP due on December 26th, just give that a little bit of thought when you're issuing it. What is the most common mistake companies make when issuing an RFP? I think I've touched on these a few times, but I'll reiterate. The way they write the questions are too broad-based. That allows for massive answers that then makes it too overwhelming to review all the different responses. Not giving enough information so that law firms are unable to price, and just generally not being as transparent, both in the beginning of the RFP and providing information, as well as following the RFP. Law firms invest significant time and money into RFPs. And if we have, 20 lawyers all working on an RFP and our marketing team all working on an RFP for a month straight, we issue it, we think we have a great shot of winning, and then we just get an email that says you were not selected. We're not going to want to submit future RFPs to you. So I think that's one mistake that corporate counsel make, is law firms want feedback as to what they could or couldn't have done better. And it's okay if it's, your prices were too high, or we found a firm with better industry experience, but you really owe them more than just you weren't selected. Otherwise, they just won't bother with future opportunities, and there's one less firm that you're going to lose the chance to work with. Will technology impact RFPs? Absolutely, and it already is. So I mentioned the RFP software that's available that'll help people issue RFPs. So what we're seeing is the easier it is for corporate counsel to issue an RFP, the more likely they are to issue them, and the more frequent they do. So as we've seen the technology make it easier for them to be issued, corporate counsel are using this technology to, initially one of the concerns a lot of corporate counsel have with RFPs is they just say, these are labor intensive, and I don't have the time based on everything else on my plate to do something like that. The software is making it a little bit easier. The other area where I think technology is really going to impact RFPs is video. Right now, you'll see some RFPs where firms may have the ability to respond to a certain question by including a link to a secure video that they've uploaded. But I think what we'll see in the future is more corporate counsel saying, what are the competitive advantages, why we should hire you? And rather than asking them for a 3-page response, written response, they will say, please send us a video, 5 minutes or less, that describes why we should select your firm. Or please send us a video of 3 minutes or less introducing the team that would be working on our matters. That's going to tell you a lot more about the person and whether you think you might be able to work with them more so than maybe their generic bio that's online. So I think you're going to see video start to be more incorporated on both sides, both because it'll allow law firms to provide more custom answers, but it also allow general counsel an easier way to review the information. So if you have to review 20 answers to a question about a competitive advantage, you might find it easier to watch 25-minute videos than to review 23-page responses. So that's just one thing that I think we'll see more in the future. So I'm looking at the time now, and we've reached the limit. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to take any of the live questions, but I do promise I will send a response to everyone who registered of any questions that came in, the questions and answers, and I'll keep the questions confidential, obviously. Also, if this program will be recorded, so within 48 hours, you'll get a link to the recording. You're welcome to share it with whoever you'd like. And following this slide, the next 3 or 4 slides, I've included 3 or 4 slides that have links to articles about some of the topics I've mentioned in the webinar. So whether it be alternative fee arrangements or some of the success examples of the RFPs, the links will bring you to reports and short articles that summarize or that talk in more detail on some of those issues. Before I let you go, I just want to put a plug in for RFP Advisory Group. We are a consulting company that works strictly on RFPs in the legal industry. What we work with clients who maybe want to do an RFP but don't have the internal resources to manage it or aren't that experienced in issuing an RFP. So what we do is we meet with you, we create a strategy with you as to what we want to accomplish by doing an RFP. We then draft the RFP and issue the RFP for you. We manage all the logistics, all the question and answers from the law firms, all the data. We then present the data to you to help you make the decision. We manage the logistics for the in-person presentations. We also manage the post-RFP operation process as far as getting back to law firms with feedback or working with the corporate counsel on the orientation of the new firms or any ongoing questions that are issues that you might have with RFPs throughout the year. Because the RFP really doesn't necessarily just stop once the new firms have been selected. You want to make sure that throughout the year it's used to accomplish your business goals. So thank you again for joining us. And if you have any questions or would like to talk to me, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.